The wind of Red Mesa cut like a whip that morning, carrying dust and the smell of sunburnt rock. A battered wagon groaned along the trail, its wheels coughing against stones that had been there long before men tried to tame this country. Inside sat Apache, thin as a willow branch, her dark hair braided tight, her eyes fixed on nothing. Every bump in the road made her injured leg throb, a dull reminder of how cheaply a life could be sold. Her uncle had told her she should be grateful. "The rancher will feed you," he'd said, silver coins glinting in his palm. But she knew better. Out here, gratitude was another word for silence. When the wagon stopped, heat shimmered off the red earth. Apache stepped down slowly, her bare foot sinking into dust hot enough to burn. The man waiting near the corral didn't speak right away. Wade Hollister looked carved from the same stone as the mesa behind him. Broad shoulders, sun-creased skin, and eyes that had seen too much sky. He wiped his hands on his jeans, the gesture of someone more used to fixing fences than greeting strangers. "You the girl Merritt sent?" he asked, voice low, rough as gravel. Apache nodded, clutching her shawl around her. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir," he said. "Ain't no lords or ladies out here, just work to be done." For a moment they simply faced each other, two people the world had scraped raw. Then Wade jerked his head toward the barn. "Come on, you look like the sun's eaten you alive." Inside, the air smelled of leather, hay, and smoke. The house was plain but clean, a single room where everything had its place. Apache's eyes flicked to a pair of spurs hanging by the door and a rifle resting above the mantel. She had never been this close to a white man's life before. Never this close to his loneliness either. Wade poured black coffee into a tin cup and set it before her. "Drink." She obeyed, wincing at the bitterness. He watched her without pity. After a while, he asked, "You eaten?" "Not since sunrise," she said. "Then you'll eat now." He ladled stew from a pot and handed her a bowl. His hands were scarred, sun-cracked, steady. She tasted the food, warm and salty. "It's good," she whispered. "It's beans," he said. "Hard to ruin beans." For a few minutes there was only the sound of the fire. The silence wasn't cruel. It was the kind that asked nothing. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled like the first leaf in spring. "I can work, Mr. Hollister. I can cook, mend, clean. My leg's slow, but I don't stop." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Didn't ask you to prove yourself." She stared into the fire. "I just don't want you to think I'm useless." He took a breath, eyes softening. "I've met useless men before. You ain't one of them." Something inside her shifted then. Something small and stubborn that had survived every cruel word her uncle ever threw. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a burden, but as a person still standing. That night she lay in the loft above the hearth, listening to coyotes cry somewhere beyond the ridge. Through the cracks in the wall, the desert sky spread endless and cold. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the scent of cedar smoke. Below her, Wade moved quietly, banking the fire, the steady rhythm of a man used to solitude. She thought of her uncle's words. "You're lucky he'll take you." Maybe luck had nothing to do with it. Maybe it was something else, some twist of the wind that had carried her here, to this hard, strange mercy. Wade's ranch clung to the side of the high desert like it had grown there. Half rock, half willpower. The land around it was bare and red, stretched so wide that the sky looked too heavy for the earth to hold. By day, the wind carried dust that stung the eyes. By night, it carried sound. Crickets, coyotes, the faint rattle of dry grass brushing the fence posts. For Apache, that first night felt like walking into another world. The small house was made of sun-bleached boards, patched with tin, and held together by habit more than nails. The smell inside was a mix of leather, smoke, and saddle soap. Sharp, clean, lonely. A single oil lamp burned on the table, throwing gold light over the wooden floor and the scarred furniture. She stood awkwardly near the door until Wade gestured toward the chair by the fire. "Sit. You'll catch cold." She hesitated before lowering herself down, her limp forcing her to move slow. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. He poured coffee from a blackened pot into a tin cup and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said softly, taking it in both hands. He nodded, sitting across from her, elbows on his knees. "You from down south?" She shook her head. "From the San Carlos Valley. My mother was born near there." He didn't press for more. In the West, a man didn't ask about a past he wasn't ready to carry. The coffee was bitter, stronger than anything she'd ever tasted. She forced herself to drink, though her stomach twisted with hunger. After a moment, Wade spoke again, his voice low and matter-of-fact. "There's stew on the stove if you want. Ain't fancy. Beans and a little beef." When she tried to stand, he stopped her with a gesture. "I'll get it." He filled a bowl and set it in front of her. The heat of the food rose up like kindness itself. She ate slowly, tasting every bite. Only after a long silence did she whisper, "I can work, Mr. Hollister. I'm not quick, but I don't stop." He glanced at her, brow furrowed. "Didn't ask you to prove yourself." Her eyes flicked down, embarrassed. "I just don't want you to think I'm broken." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The firelight threw red over his weathered face. "You think I ain't seen hurt before? The land breaks everything that lives long enough. What matters is what gets back up." Her throat tightened. She nodded once, unsure how to answer. After supper, he showed her the small loft above the main room. "You can sleep up there. Roof leaks a bit when it storms, but it's dry tonight." She climbed the narrow ladder carefully, her bad leg dragging slightly. When she reached the top, she looked down and saw him add another log to the fire before turning away. The bed was just a pile of quilts and straw, but it was soft. She lay down, staring at the dark beams above her, listening to the wind slip through the cracks. It had been a long time since she'd slept anywhere that felt like safety. Below, Wade moved about quietly, tidying the dishes, his boots thumping lightly on the floor. She closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of cedar and smoke. For the first time in years, the silence didn't frighten her. It almost felt kind. Morning came bright and sharp. The desert outside glowed gold under the rising sun. Apache woke to the sound of Wade chopping wood behind the house. She sat up, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and watched through the window. He worked without hurry, each swing of the axe steady and certain. The sight of it was almost soothing. The rhythm, the control, the quiet strength. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, the smell of dry grass sharp in her nose. Wade paused mid-swing and looked up. "You sleep all right?" She nodded. "Yes, thank you." "Good. There's chores if you're feeling steady." He nodded toward the coop. "Feed the chickens, check the troughs if you can manage. Don't strain that leg." "I'll be fine." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't need teeth to be real. "Everybody says that before the ground reminds them otherwise." She bent to pick up the feed bucket. It was heavier than she expected, but she refused to ask for help. The path to the coop was uneven, the dirt packed hard as stone. She stumbled once, caught herself, and kept going. Wade went back to chopping, pretending not to notice, but he saw. She scattered the feed, watched the chickens peck and squabble, then filled the water trough from the well. By the time she was done, her arms ached and her leg throbbed, but she stood a little taller. When she turned back toward the house, Wade was waiting by the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're stubborn," he said. She smiled, just barely. "So I've been told." "Good. You'll need that out here." Later that afternoon, they shared a quiet meal. The wind had died down, and the whole valley seemed to be holding its breath. Wade fixed a broken stirrup while she stirred the pot on the stove. The smell of beans filled the room. "You ever worked a ranch before?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, my family raised horses. Wild ones sometimes." He looked up. "That where you got that scar?" She hesitated. "No, that was something else." He didn't push further. He only nodded, as if saying, "All right, not my business." That simple act, the refusal to pry, meant more to her than any kindness had in years. That night, as the desert cooled and coyotes started their song, Wade sat by the fire, whittling a block of wood into something shapeless. Apache mended a tear in one of his shirts. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was the kind that fills a room with peace. After a while, she asked, "Do you ever get lonely out here?" He didn't answer right away. The knife kept sliding along the grain. Finally, he said, "Sometimes, but I figure the wind talks enough for two." She smiled faintly. "It never says much to me." "Then you ain't been listening long enough." They shared a small laugh, quiet but warm. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear. When she climbed to the loft that night, Apache paused halfway up the ladder and looked down at him. He was still sitting by the fire, head bowed, eyes lost in the flames. There was something in that stillness, a weight she couldn't name. Maybe he was as broken as she was, just in different ways. And for the first time, she wondered if two broken souls could make something whole between them. The fire popped. Wade looked up, met her eyes for half a second, and nodded once before turning back to the flames. Apache climbed the rest of the way, heart steady and strange, like the quiet beginning of something she didn't yet dare to hope for. The days rolled by like tumbleweeds across the valley, slow, wind-blown, and stubborn. Life at Wade Hollister's ranch was carved out of rhythm and sweat, the hammer striking nails, the creak of saddles, the low nicker of horses waiting to be fed. Every sound felt like a heartbeat against the endless hush of Red Mesa. Apache woke with the dawn each morning, pulling her braid over her shoulder and wrapping her shawl tight before stepping into the cold. The desert never gave you anything easy. The air cut sharp at sunrise and burned your skin by noon. But she met each day head-on, limping through her chores with a quiet determination that both humbled and haunted Wade. He watched from a distance at first, from the fence line or the porch, pretending to check his tools. She carried buckets of water that sloshed against her skirt, scrubbed the floorboards until her palms went raw, and gathered kindling with one hand while steadying herself on a limp that never let her forget. She didn't complain. Not once. When she stumbled, she cursed under her breath in Apache, then steadied herself and kept going. That fire in her, the kind born from survival, was something Wade hadn't seen in years. "You're stubborn," he called out one afternoon, leaning on his shovel. She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. If I wasn't, I'd be dead by now. Wade chuckled, the sound rough and low, like it had to climb its way out of his chest. Reckon that's a fair reason. And then she smiled. It wasn't much, just a flicker of warmth across her face, but it hit him harder than the desert sun. It was the first time he'd seen it since she arrived, and it changed the way the world looked for the rest of the day. By late afternoon, the sky burned gold, the heat softened, and the ranch turned quiet except for the lazy buzz of cicadas. Apache was sitting by the fence, mending a torn blanket, while Wade fixed the hinge on the barn door. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It had settled into something easy, like two souls sharing the same air without needing words. Been here almost a week now, Wade said finally, testing the new hinge. Ain't scared off yet? She tied off a thread and looked up at him. You don't scare me, Mr. Hollister. That right? Men who shout do, men who hit. She paused, her gaze steady. You don't do either. He nodded, throat tightening around words he didn't know how to say. The truth was, he didn't know what kind of man he was anymore, just that he didn't want to be one who caused more pain. Suppose that's something to be proud of, he said finally, forcing a smile. It is, she replied, soft but certain. As evening fell, the wind carried the scent of sage through the open window. The fire cracked in the hearth, throwing orange light across the room. Wade sat at the table, whittling a small piece of pine into something shapeless. Across from him, Apache stirred a pot of stew, the steam rising between them like a fragile bridge. He watched her quietly. The way her shoulders moved as she worked, the concentration in her eyes, it all stirred something he'd thought long buried. Not desire, not yet. Just a kind of peace. You ever stop moving? He asked, half teasing. She glanced over her shoulder. Idle hands make me nervous. He grinned. You and me both. For a moment, it almost felt like they'd known each other for years. Two souls who'd been through enough to understand silence better than speech. When the food was ready, she ladled it into bowls and set one in front of him. It's just beans, she said. Hard to ruin beans, he replied with a smirk. She laughed. A small sound, but it filled the room. Later, after the dishes were washed and the fire burned low, Wade leaned back in his chair and let his gaze wander around the cabin. It didn't look any different than before. Same worn floorboards, same cracked lamp, but somehow it felt different. For years, his home had been nothing but shelter from wind and rain. Now it carried the faint scent of stew, the hum of life, the quiet trace of another heartbeat beside his. He caught himself staring at Apache as she folded the mended blanket. The lamplight brushed her cheekbones, turning her skin to copper. Her limp was still there, her movements still careful, but there was a strength in them that drew him in. She looked up suddenly, catching him watching. He cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. You work too hard, he muttered. She tilted her head, half smiling. So do you. Difference is I'm paid for it. I didn't come here for pay. That made him pause. Then what did you come for? Apache's eyes lowered, a place where the shouting stops. Her words hit him like a kick to the gut. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of rope and iron, and felt the weight of her truth hang between them. You got that here, he said quietly. Ain't nobody gonna raise their voice to you under this roof. When she met his eyes again, there was something raw in her expression, something close to trust. Thank you, she whispered. That night, Wade couldn't sleep. The moonlight poured silver through the cracks in the shutters, drawing lines across the floor. He sat at the edge of his bed, listening to the wind outside, to the faint sound of her breathing from the loft above. He'd lived alone so long that he'd forgotten what another presence felt like. Not noise, not company, just knowing someone else was under the same roof, breathing the same night air. The loneliness that had once been his armor now felt like a wound. He went to the fireplace, stirred the dying embers, and added another log. The flames flared, throwing warmth across the room. From the loft, her voice drifted down, soft, sleepy. "Mr. Hollister?" "Yeah?" "The roof doesn't leak." He smiled into the fire. "Told you it wouldn't." She didn't answer after that, and soon the silence settled again, heavy but gentle. Wade sat there a long time, staring at the flames, listening to the desert whisper outside. He realized then that the quiet wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't empty. It wasn't hollow. It was alive. And for the first time in years, Wade Hollister didn't want the morning to come too soon. The morning broke cool and still, the kind of quiet that came before the desert started to breathe heat. Mist hung low over the canyon, thin as smoke, and the sun spilled gold across the red rock. Wade led the way down a narrow trail that wound between juniper and stone, 2 empty buckets swinging from his shoulder. Behind him, Apache walked carefully, her shawl pulled tight, her limp noticeable in the uneven dirt. They reached the creek, a silver ribbon cutting through the scarlet land. The water was cold, clear enough to see the pebbles winking on the bottom. Wade set his buckets down and crouched to fill them, the muscles in his arms flexing beneath his shirt. When he looked up, Apache was kneeling nearby, her reflection trembling in the water. She bent forward and winced, a small sound escaping her. Wade noticed immediately. "That leg of yours giving you trouble again?" She didn't answer at first. The only sound was the trickle of water over stone. Then, softly, "It always does. Some mornings worse than others." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That happened from a fall or something?" The question hung in the air like the echo of a gunshot. Apache froze, her fingers tightening around the wooden handle of the bucket. For a long while, she said nothing. Only the wind moved, whispering through the pines that clung to the cliff above them. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely a breath. "He pushed me. My uncle." Wade's jaw tightened. "I tried to stop him from beating our horse," she went on. "He was drunk. The animal was crying, and I—" Her voice faltered, eyes locked on the water. "He hit me, and I fell from the loft. The bone broke. It never healed right. He said it was my fault." The air between them changed, sharp as the edge of flint. Wade gripped the handle of his axe so hard his knuckles whitened. The old anger that lived deep inside him, the one he'd buried beneath years of silence, stirred awake. "What kind of man hurts a woman like that?" His voice was low, rough. "Ain't a man at all." She shook her head quickly. "Don't go looking for him, please." He turned toward her. "You think I don't want revenge," she said, her tone steady but heavy. "I just want to forget." Wade let out a long breath, setting the axe aside. "You don't need to forget," he said quietly. "You just need to remember that you lived through it." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Something deep passed between them, understanding, quiet, and fierce. They worked in silence after that, scooping water and pouring it into buckets. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon walls to fire. When the last bucket was full, Wade lifted them both with ease, though his shoulders strained beneath the weight. Let me carry one, she said. He shook his head. You carried enough already. Her gaze softened. You talk like a preacher sometimes. He smiled faintly. No preacher ever spent this much time fixing fences. The walk back was slow. Apache kept close behind him, her limp more pronounced on the rocky path. Once, her foot slipped on loose gravel, and she reached out instinctively. Wade caught her arm, steadying her. Got you, he said. For a moment, her hand stayed in his. Small, calloused, warm. Then she pulled back, eyes averted. Thank you. Don't mention it. They continued on without a word, but the space between them had changed. It wasn't distance anymore. It was something fragile, something that felt like trust beginning to take root in dry soil. By noon, the sky burned white. The ranch shimmered in the heat, the fences warping in the distance. Wade set the buckets by the trough and leaned on the rail, sweat tracing lines down his temples. Apache sat on the porch steps, rubbing her leg. He noticed how she tried to hide the pain behind a calm face. She'd learned to live that way, quiet, unseen. You push yourself too hard, he said. She looked up, squinting against the light. Work keeps me from thinking too much. He nodded slowly. Sometimes that's a mercy. She hesitated before asking, You ever think too much, Mr. Hollister? He smiled, a little sad. Every damn day. The honesty in his voice made her chest ache. That evening, the wind came back strong, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere far off. They sat inside as thunder rolled across the horizon. Apache mended a torn sleeve, while Wade patched the latch on the barn door. The lamp flickered between them, turning the walls gold and shadow. After a while, she said quietly, You didn't ask what happened to my mother. He paused, hammer mid-swing. Didn't figure it was my place. She died when I was little. Fever. Her hands trembled slightly as she stitched. My uncle took me in after that. Said I owed him for keeping me alive. Wade leaned against the wall, eyes dark. You don't owe him a damn thing. Her mouth trembled, but she nodded. Folks like him, he said, they break everything they touch. But it don't mean you stay broken. She looked up, and there it was again. That flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, cautious and new. When the rain came, it hit the roof like a drum. The scent of wet earth seeped through the cracks. Wade sat by the window, watching lightning crawl over the mountains. Apache joined him quietly, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Storms scare the horses? She asked. Sometimes. They settle when they hear my voice. She smiled faintly. Then you must talk a lot. He chuckled. Not near as much as I used to. Thunder cracked, close enough to rattle the panes. She jumped slightly. Without thinking, Wade reached out and rested a hand over hers. Her skin was cool, soft against his rough palm. She didn't pull away. The storm roared outside, but inside, something gentler began to stir. A calm that came not from silence, but from being understood. By the time the rain stopped, the fire had burned low. Apache rose to light another lantern, her limp more pronounced from the cold. Wade watched her quietly, then stood and said, I'll fix that roof before next storm hits. She turned, smiling. You already did. It doesn't leak anymore. He froze for a second, remembering her words from nights before, and felt a strange warmth spread through him. Maybe he wasn't fixing just the roof. Maybe, without knowing it, he was mending something else too. As the thunder faded into distance, they stood there in the soft light. Two people shaped by loss, now learning how to live again. One careful word, one quiet evening at a time. Outside, the desert was still. But inside Wade Hollister's house, the air carried something new. Not the emptiness of solitude, but the first quiet breath of belonging. The afternoon sun burned low and mean, turning the plains the color of rust. Wind swept across Red Mesa, carrying the taste of sand and the promise of trouble. Wade Hollister felt it before he saw it. Two riders climbing the ridge, their figures dark against the glare. Trouble always announced itself in pairs. He set his hammer down by the corral and wiped sweat from his brow. The horses in the pen stirred uneasily, ears twitching at the sound of hooves on hard earth. Wade straightened, the lines around his eyes deepening. Whoever was coming rode with too much purpose to be friendly. When the riders reached the clearing, Wade's gut went tight. The first man, a lean, gray-eyed brute with a smirk that didn't fit his face, he recognized from Akacheta's trembling description. Elias Greyhawk, her uncle. "Well, look at that," Elias drawled, swinging off his horse like he owned the place. His hat was clean, his boots were city-polished, but there was nothing civilized about the grin that split his face. "Didn't think you'd have the stones to meet me proper, Hollister." Wade's voice stayed low, steady. "Didn't think I needed to. What are you doing here?" Elias patted the dust from his jacket, eyes scanning the property like he was picking out what he'd take first. "I came for the girl. She's mine. You bought her fair and square, didn't you? Contract said she was to be your wife. You changed your mind. Fine. I'll take her back." Behind him, the second rider, some skinny clerk of a man, shifted uneasily in his saddle, clutching a leather satchel. He didn't meet Wade's gaze. Wade folded his arms across his chest. "She ain't yours to take. Not now, not ever." Elias laughed, a harsh sound that didn't belong in the open air. "You really believe that? You think a half-blood cripple means something out here? She's property. Always was. Always will be." Wade's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed calm. "You say that again? You won't finish the sentence." Elias sneered. "You got a big mouth for a man hiding behind an Indian girl. Must be nice playing the savior." The words hung in the hot air like a challenge. The clerk dismounted, eyes darting between them. "Mr. Hollister, sir," he stammered, fumbling in his satchel. "I was sent by the county office. I believe there's been a mistake." He pulled out an envelope, its seal still unbroken. "This document came through the circuit judge last week. The storm delayed it." Wade took it without breaking eye contact with Elias. He tore the seal open. The words were simple and final. "The sale of Akacheta Greyhawk is annulled. All rights revoked." His hand tightened on the page, veins rising against tanned skin. When he finally looked up, his eyes were cold as iron. "You came here lying, Greyhawk." Elias spat into the dirt. "Paper don't change the truth. She's damaged goods. No man wants her. You'll see that soon enough." That was the last thing he said before Wade's fist hit him. The blow cracked through the air like a rifle shot. Elias stumbled backward, hit the ground hard, and rolled in the dust, blood streaking from his lip. Wade stepped forward, his shadow cutting across him. "You listen close," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You're done hurting her. You come back here again, and I'll bury you where you stand." For a long second, the only sound was wind and the slow creak of Elias's saddle. The man spat blood, eyes full of venom. But even snakes know when they've met a boot heel. He scrambled to his feet, glaring up at Wade. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "Maybe," Wade said. but not as much as you would if you take one more step toward that door." Elias froze, then turned, mounting his horse in silence. The clerk followed quick, relief written all over his pale face. When they rode off down the trail, the wind swallowed the sound of their hooves. Wade stood there a long time, the paper still in his hand, the anger still pounding in his chest. It had been years since he'd thrown a punch. His knuckles throbbed, but it felt right. The porch creaked behind him. Apache stood there, framed by the fading light. The look on her face tore something inside him, half fear, half disbelief. "I saw them," she whispered. Wade turned, his voice softer now. "You don't have to be afraid. He's gone." "He came for me, didn't he?" He nodded. "Tried to." She stepped down slowly, her limp more pronounced in the sand. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, eyes glistening. "He'll come back. He always does." "No," Wade said, handing her the paper. "Not this time." She took it with trembling fingers. The seal was still warm from his hand. When she read the words, she blinked, as if they didn't make sense. "This means... It means you're free," he said quietly. "Completely. He can't touch you now." Her breath hitched. For a moment she just stared at the page, the edges fluttering in the wind. Then she looked up at him, tears cutting lines through the dust on her cheeks. "You shouldn't have risked that for me." "I didn't risk anything I wasn't willing to lose." The way he said it, plain, without hesitation, made her chest ache. She pressed the paper against her heart, like she could feel the truth beating through it. That night, the desert cooled fast. The wind died down, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Apache sat by the window, the document folded neatly in her lap. Wade was outside, pacing the porch, his silhouette dark against the stars. When he finally came in, he poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one toward her. "Drink. You look like you ain't breathed since noon." She smiled faintly. "Feels strange, being free." He sat opposite her. "Freedom's strange for everyone the first time." "Do you remember yours?" she asked quietly. He thought about it. The day he left home after burying his wife. The day he decided not to die out there in the dust. "Yeah," he said after a while. "It didn't feel like wings. More like weight I had to learn how to carry different." She nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." The rest of the night passed in quiet peace. Outside, the coyotes howled in the distance, a sound that once made her skin crawl, but now felt like a song for survivors. Wade stood by the doorway, watching her. The firelight played across her face, softening every line carved by hardship. For the first time, she wasn't the frightened girl who'd limped off a wagon. She was something else. Something stronger. Steadier. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "I'll take that paper into town. Get it filed proper with the clerk. Make sure no one questions it." She looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "Thank you, Wade." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. Just start living like you ain't owned by ghosts anymore." When she went to bed, Wade stayed up by the fire, the same paper lying on the table beside him. The flames danced over the inked words. Free woman. He thought about how easily the world called ownership law and called cruelty order, and he thought about the girl upstairs, how she'd survived every lie they'd tried to make her believe. The desert was quiet again. But this time, Wade didn't hear loneliness in it. He heard freedom breathing. Spring rolled into Red Mesa like a promise kept too long. The snowmelt from the high ridges filled the streams until they ran clear again, glinting between rocks the color of rusted iron. The air that once bit at the lungs now carried the smell of wet grass and juniper bloom. calves bawled in the pastures, and a colt, Wade Hollister's first foal in 3 hard years, let out a sharp, eager whinny that made even the wind pause to listen. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Wade smiled without meaning to. He stood by the corral fence that morning, one boot resting on the bottom rail, watching the young horse kick at the sky. The world felt wide again, open in a way it hadn't since before the grief, before the silence that used to sit heavy in his house. Behind him, the door creaked open. Apache stepped out with her shawl drawn tight against the lingering chill. Her limp was still there, but her stride had changed. Less burden, more balance. Each morning she walked a little farther, worked a little longer, and hummed a tune she said her mother used to sing in the San Carlos Valley. It wasn't loud, just a thread of melody that wove itself into the day. "You hear that?" Wade asked, nodding toward the corral. "Sound of new lungs figuring out they're alive?" She smiled softly. "Sounds like freedom." He glanced at her. "Guess you'd know that sound better than most." Apache didn't answer, just rested her hands on the fence post beside him. The sunlight caught her hair, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. The days grew long and gentle. Wade fixed the eastern fence line while Apache tended the garden behind the cabin. The hard earth that had once refused to yield now gave up shoots of green beans and wildflowers she'd scattered for luck, she'd said. Every evening they ate together on the porch, the sun dropping low behind the red hills, the sky a bruised violet fading to gold. He'd begun to notice little things, how she always laughed with her eyes first, how she tilted her head when listening to the coyotes sing at night. Once, she caught him staring and asked, "What are you thinking?" He shrugged. "Just wondering if maybe this place ain't as empty as I thought." Her laughter came quiet and warm. "It was never empty, Wade. You just stopped hearing it." One morning, they rode together out to the ridge where the land sloped down toward the creek. The air was soft and heavy with the scent of wet soil. Wade's old chestnut gelding led the way, while Apache followed on the young mare they'd broken together the week before. Her posture in the saddle was proud, confident, the stiffness in her leg no longer dictating her pace. When they reached the top, the view opened like a secret. Miles of green spilling through the valley, dotted with wild lupin and the shimmer of distant water. Wade reined in and looked out across the land. "Never thought I'd see it look this alive again." Apache dismounted carefully, her boots crunching on the gravel. "You brought it back," she said. "You and the rain." He smiled faintly. "I think maybe you had a hand in that, too." She turned to him, the sun lighting her face. "Me? I didn't do anything but work." He shook his head. "You did more than work. You gave the place a reason to breathe again." Her expression softened, but her voice was steady. "What do you see when you look at it?" Wade took a long breath, eyes sweeping over the valley. "I see land that's mine, and I see someone who made it mean something again." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind carried the scent of sage, and the cry of an eagle echoed from the cliffs. Apache looked down at her hands, then back toward the horizon. "Freedom," she said quietly, "isn't just leaving. It's finding somewhere that makes you want to stay." Wade turned toward her then, the sunlight glinting off the stubble on his jaw. "Guess you found it?" She smiled, a small, quiet smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Maybe I did." Later that day, they worked side by side fixing the barn roof, laughter mixing with the clatter of tools. When Wade slipped on a loose board, she reached out, catching his arm before he fell. The touch was brief but grounding, calloused fingers against calloused skin. He looked at her, something raw flickering between them, then said gruffly, "You got quick hands for someone who walks slow." "Guess I make up for it where I can," she teased. They both laughed, and for once, it didn't sound like two people patching up old wounds. It sounded like home. That night, after supper, Wade poured himself a small glass of whiskey and sat by the window. The moonlight fell over the floorboards, turning them silver. He watched Apache move about the room, closing shutters, humming softly. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked suddenly. She looked up, surprised. "Leaving?" He nodded. "Now that you can. Paper says you're free to go anywhere you please." She paused for a long moment, then shook her head. "I did my running, Wade. Spent half my life trying to get away from something. Maybe it's time to run towards something instead." He met her eyes. "You know you'd be welcome to stay," she smiled gently. "I know, and I want to." Those words landed somewhere deep inside him. Spring pressed on, the foal grew strong, the creek ran full, and every night the desert cooled into something close to peace. Wade found himself sleeping easier, dreaming less about the past and more about tomorrow. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn and see her shadow move past the window, already tending the animals, her limp just a part of her rhythm now. He'd watch her for a while, the first light catching her face, and feel something stir that wasn't loneliness anymore. Maybe it was what came after it. One evening, they climbed the hill again. The grass brushed their boots, and the sky flamed orange as the sun sank behind the mesas. The world was quiet but alive, the kind of quiet that hums with everything unsaid. Apache stood beside him, her hair catching the last light. "You see that?" she asked softly. "All of it?" He nodded. "Yeah, what do you see?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "I see the land I worked my whole life to keep. And I see the person who made me remember why I wanted to." She turned to him, her eyes shining like water under firelight. "Then maybe this land isn't yours alone anymore." Wade smiled, slow and certain. "Wouldn't mind sharing it." They stood there until the sun was gone, the wind brushing through the grass like a blessing. For the first time, neither of them felt like they were standing on borrowed ground. They were home. Summer came to Red Mesa, dressed in gold. The grass rolled like waves under the bright sun, and the cottonwoods shimmered green along the creek. The scent of wild sage drifted through the air, thick with heat and promise. Life pulsed in every inch of the land, the chickens clucking by the fence, the horses swishing their tails lazily in the light. And somewhere between it all, laughter, hers, rang out across the valley. Apache's voice carried easy now, lighter than the wind that once haunted this place. She walked the path from the hills with a basket full of strawberries, her steps steady, her shadow no longer limping behind her. The years of fear had melted away, replaced by something quiet and strong. Wade waited for her by the porch, hat tipped low against the sun. When he saw her, he smiled. That slow, unguarded kind of smile that came only after years of forgetting how. "You walk steadier than me these days," he teased, reaching for the basket. Apache handed it to him, brushing the dust from her palms. "Maybe because I stopped being afraid of falling." He chuckled. "Guess that makes one of us." The air between them was warm and easy, filled with the sound of cicadas and the smell of sweet grass. She looked at him then. Really looked. The man who had once been more silence than voice, more shadow than light. His eyes were softer now, the edges of his grief worn smooth by time and her presence. "When I first came here," she said, her voice trembling like sunlight on water, "I thought I was just a shadow, something that passed through other people's lives. Wade turned toward her, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. And now? She smiled faintly, her gaze drifting over the ranch, the barn, the horses grazing under the cottonwoods. Now I think I'm someone. He stepped closer, his hand finding hers without thought, fingers rough and warm. You are, he said simply. You always were. You just needed someone to remind you. Akacheta's eyes glistened in the light. You shouldn't say things like that, Wade Hollister. Why not? Because I'll start believing them. He smiled, gentle, certain. Good, you should. As the sun sank lower, they climbed the hill behind the house, the same one where they had first stood months ago when the world felt uncertain and new. The wind brushed through the grass, whispering through the canyons like an old friend. From up there, the valley looked alive, a quilt of green stitched with water and light. They stood shoulder to shoulder, quiet for a long while. What do you see down there? She asked softly. Wade squinted into the distance, his voice slow and thoughtful. I see land that's mine, he said, then paused. And someone who made it worth keeping. Akacheta turned to him, the sunset spilling gold across her face. Freedom isn't about leaving, she said. It's about finding a place that makes you want to stay. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. Then I guess you found it. She nodded. We both did. For a long time, they just stood there, two silhouettes framed by the fading light. His hand rested lightly over hers, their shadows stretching long across the hill. That night, after supper, they sat on the porch while the crickets sang and the stars came out one by one. The air was soft, the kind of stillness that feels earned. Akacheta leaned back in her chair, her head tilted toward the sky. Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't met? She asked. Wade thought for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. I'd probably still be talking to the wind, pretending it was listening. She smiled. And I'd still be running. He glanced at her. Funny thing about running, you always think it's away from something. Turns out sometimes it's toward. The words hung there, soft and true. Akacheta reached into her basket and held up a strawberry, offering it to him. Taste it, she said. He took it, biting into the fruit. It was warm from the sun, sweet and wild. That's the best thing I've had in years. Because it grew here, she said. Because it's home. When the fire died down and the stars turned brighter, Akacheta rose and walked to the edge of the porch. The moon painted her face silver, and Wade thought she looked like something out of a story too old to tell. Wade, she said softly, you saved me. He shook his head. No, you saved yourself. I just happened to be standing close enough to see it. She turned toward him, eyes shining. Then maybe we saved each other. He stood, crossing the distance between them. The night air hummed with heat and heart. When his hand found hers again, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Out there, beneath the wide American sky, the two of them stood, one man and one woman, both scarred, both healed by the same wind that had once cut them raw. The land around them breathed, alive and waiting. And in the quiet, their love didn't roar or blaze. It simply was. Steady, patient, and sure, like the wind that moved through the canyons, whispering a truth older than either of them. Even when it limps, love always finds its way home.